Manhattan Virtual Academy.
We live in Wamego, and I am on the Oztober Fest planning committee, and I am an education coordinator. So it is my pleasure to bring you Miles Schneider, a Kansas notable author of 2010, who has a modern interpretation of the Oz books through Silver Shoes and Powder of Life and the Magic Belts. And I am not going to give much else away because that's all part of his show here, his presentation today.
But the rest of it is a spoiler.
Yeah, a spoiler. So let's welcome Paul.
Thank you so much, virtual and non-virtual people. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm just going to dive right in and start with where it all began. This is ground zero for me, The Wizard of Oz. How many of you have actually read the novel by L. Frank Baum, the book? How many of you have seen the movie? It's the usual case. A lot more people have seen the movie than have read the book. I was actually probably about 5 years old when I was introduced to Oz, both the book and the movie. My mom had these old worn copies of about 5 of the Oz books, and for those of you that don't know, L. Frank Baum did write more than just The Wizard of Oz. He ended up writing 14 books in his own series, all based off of The Wizard of Oz. So there were these old worn books that had once belonged to my grandfather, and I never knew him. Our generations were spread out a lot, so my grandfather died 3 years before I was born, but at the turn of the last century, he was about 5, maybe 6 years old when the first story came out, and he would receive them at Christmas time. So I had these books in front of me as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old. I was learning to read from them, and my mom was reading to me. And they had his name. You know how it says this book belongs to, and he wrote George Miles March in it. And my middle name is Miles. And I remember thinking this was really cool. I had something in my hand that I could hold that he had when he was a kid, and we were sort of taking this journey together, even though I never got to meet him. And so it was special. It meant a lot to me. It was a pretty big impact. Around the same time, I saw The Wizard of Oz on television. And being a kid of the late 60s, early 70s, color TV was just kind of really catching on. It had been around a little earlier, but people were starting to really have it in their living room. And here was a movie that starts in black and white and switches to color, and it just was the best thing to see on television, to sort of open up the world on a color TV to see this movie. The other thing that's different than everybody today, really, is that when I grew up, you didn't have on demand, you didn't have streaming, you didn't have DVD, Blu-ray, ways to see movies where you guys can watch a movie whenever you want to. We had one chance a year. It was The Wizard of Oz was an annual televised event. It was on one time, and that was it. So if you missed it, you had to wait another year to see it. And for me, as a kid, there were like 3 big events. There was Christmas, there was my birthday, and then there was the annual telecast of The Wizard of Oz every year. And I kind of anticipated all 3 the same. I mean, it was like I couldn't wait for these 3 big fun events as a kid. That's me growing up in the Midwest. I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, not too far from Manhattan. I was a pretty normal kid, I guess a hippie kid a bit. You see the tie-dyed shirt there. And I played with marionettes, so I was on the creative side at least. But one thing that was slightly unusual was my father was an educational filmmaker. He was a cameraman and a photographer, and he worked for a company in Lawrence called Centron. And they made educational films, and I got to appear in quite a few of them. And a couple of them I was the lead as a kid. I was in one in particular. It was called A Rainy Day Story. And this was about a kid who's given an assignment in school to write a creative story and use the things around him to see them in different ways and ask the magic words, what if? And I have a clip from that here when I was 9.
What did you do in school today, Paul?
The last time I asked you children to write a story and use your imagination, I got 13 stories on how I went to the store with my mother. Now this time, I want you to call it a rainy day story, and this time, children, I want you to use more of the word I got written on the board. Imagination. Your minds are like big empty storehouses. Begin to fill them. Begin by asking yourselves, what if? The magic what if, and go on from there. Begin by asking yourselves, what if? The magic what if, and go on from there. You can start by learning to use the things around you in new ways, to see them in new ways.
And that's really what I did. I mean, I took those words to heart. They made a lot of impact on me back at the time. So I was, growing up in Kansas, I would see an old farmhouse or a windmill off it, or an empty field or an ominous sky, and I would think, you know, I'm growing up in Kansas, Dorothy did in the story, maybe, what if she was a real person? What if she actually existed? Maybe that old farmhouse that's falling apart over there, what if that was her house 100 years ago? So I already started thinking in terms of, yeah, I knew it was a fantasy, but what if the two words, what if it really happened? So I was born in Kansas, in Lawrence, Kansas, oh, excuse me, I wasn't born in Lawrence, I was born in New York City. I grew up in Lawrence. But my mother was an actress. She was on Broadway, live television in the 1950s. She was a Lawrence native that moved to New York. And my father was a cameraman when I was born. He was on the Patty Duke Show, which was a sitcom in the early 1960s. And the way sitcoms work is that you film for 9 months. They still do this. You film for 9 months out of the year, and then you get 3 months off. And during those 3 months, we would come to Lawrence, Kansas, where my grandmother lived. As a child, me and my younger brother, we got to see what it was like in Kansas growing up, in a nice environment, out of the big city. And ultimately, after the Patty Duke Show ended, my father and mother decided to move here. So we bought a house over in Lawrence, and I grew up in that area, and it was, a nice environment to be a kid in. We did come back in 1969, 3 years after we moved, for my Uncle Bobby's wedding. And my mother had read in a newspaper that in New York, Margaret Hamilton, who had played the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, she was appearing in a live stage production of Oklahoma at Lincoln Center. And so she decided to write my dad's dad, my paternal grandfather, and there's a picture of him here with me there, and my grandmother. He had been an executive at Warner Brothers. He was there from the beginning of the studio until 1955. He'd already been retired for about 14 years. But she wrote him and said, do you have any connections? Could you maybe get Paul in to see Margaret Hamilton? He would like to meet her. He loves The Wizard of Oz. He loves The Wicked Witch of the West. So she arranged a very special meeting. So I did get to meet her, but what happened was we went backstage after the performance, and we walked down this long hall, and there were probably about 20 or 30 people waiting to meet her to get her autograph and stuff. And I got ushered in ahead of all of it. And my mother brought me right up to the dressing room. We walked in, and I'm looking, at this nice lady. She seemed like an older, sweet lady. And, she says, you must be Paul. And I nodded, and she said, well, I understand you have questions for me. And she looked at my mom and said, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak to Paul alone. So my mom said, sure. She backed out of the dressing room, closed the door. And it was just the two of us, with these people waiting outside to meet her. And I thought, this is kind of great and wonderful. And she said, do you have questions? And I said, of course. I wanted to know, how did she melt? How did they make you fly? How did they turn you green? And I can say that she really treated me like an adult. She didn't talk to me, like, well, there's magic, and I was green because I was evil. She basically, for how she melted, she told me that they had a longer dress that they had tacked around this platform. And they did that so they could puff dry ice and smoke up around her while they lowered her slowly on the platform. And for the moment where they hit her in the face with the water, they put a larger hat on her head, and it was connected to wires. So as they're lowering her into the ground, they're pulling the hat down over her face, so it looks sort of like she's shrinking away. But there's no CGI, there's no special effects. They're just doing this live as if they were doing it on stage. And so I'll play that scene for you now. This is, again, how she explained it to me.
How about a little fire, Scarecrow?
That's the larger hat.
I'm melting! Oh, what a world! Who would have thought a good little girl like you could destroy my beautiful wickedness? The mouse! I'm going!
I think it's still pretty effective. It still works today. No unusual computer effects. They didn't have them back then. So she had questions for me, which I thought was nice too. She said, where did you go to school? Do you have any brothers or sisters? Are your parents involved in theater? She could tell I understood about trapdoors and piano wire effects and that kind of thing, and smoke and dry ice, all those things. And at one point, though, she looked at me, she said, you don't believe I was the Wicked Witch of the West, though, do you? And I said, well, you're a nice lady. I mean, I understand this was a while ago. I didn't say it quite like that, but I was like, I understand. My mom's an actress. You wore makeup, all that. And she said, well, maybe this will convince you. And then she did the laugh. And if you can imagine you're 7 years old and you're in this room with the lady by yourself, there's people outside, but it's just you and her, and you hear that laugh. I was in the presence of the Wicked Witch of the West, there was no question. And it's something I'll never forget. I love that she did that, And I think my mother came in shortly after that because she thought I was being murdered. And she said, at this point, people were waiting to go in. She said, I don't have any pictures here, but if you give me your address, I'll mail you an autographed photo. So my mother gave her our address, and I went back, started second grade after that, and sure enough, about a week or two later, I got an autographed photo from Margaret Hamilton in the mail. And as the school year started that year, we were given an assignment to have a pen pal. And the idea was that it should be somebody you recently met, that didn't live in the state of Kansas, and that wasn't a relative. And so, the teacher went around the class, and she was like, who you're going to write. She was asking various students, and they were saying, my friend from Camp Mike, or this girl I met at Grandma's named Jill. And I raised my hand and very precociously said, I will be writing The Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. And so that night my mother got a phone call from the teacher who said, your son is weird. He thinks he's going to write The Witch from The Wizard of Oz. And she explained the assignment to my mother, and my mom said, well, he did meet her recently. She doesn't live in the state of Kansas, and she's not a relative. So she fits the assignment. If she agrees to do that, would that be okay? And the teacher said, sure. So I wrote Margaret Hamilton a little note. I explained about the assignment, and I said, would you be my pen pal? And she said, yes. So for the entire second grade school year, I had the Wicked Witch of the West as a pen pal. Margaret Hamilton wrote me back and forth. I ended up with 3 autographed photos, all signed by her at the bottom, and postcards. It was a pretty wonderful experience, and it definitely helped make Oz, again, a real place for me. Another real-life Oz experience I had, Mom was reading the newspaper again, something that's always good to do. She saw a little notice that said that there was a stuntman coming through from California, and he had a horse that had appeared in many westerns. He was a trainer, an animal trainer. He also had this pony, an older pony, that had been featured when he was 6 months old. This little pony was in The Wizard of Oz. He's one of the 2 ponies that's dragging Dorothy's carriage around through the Munchkinland sequence. And that same pony was very busy that year. He was in another classic movie from 1939, Gone with the Wind. He's the horse, the little pony that throws Bonnie Blue Butler, the girl that you see in the picture there, over the horse. She jumps over and she dies. So I was thinking, I'm riding a pony that killed a little girl. This is awesome. And there I am in my very sad striped pants, riding Admiral, the pony. He was much older. He was probably like 32, 33-year-old pony at this point, so they were limiting the number of rides, but I got to ride him that day. And that's the trainer, Jack Ryan, with him. I also got to play the Tin Man at Kansas Repertory Theater when I was 19 years old. I got to put on that costume 8 shows a week and fry under the lights. It's kind of like being a baked potato on stage. But it was a lot of fun, and a dream come true, really, to be in that environment. It was a big production, too, a lot of fun. Also, like many people who are in Kansas, I was in a tornado. But the difference was I was actually in it. It kind of landed on my head, is what I like to say. It landed about 100 feet from where we were. We were in this, if you look up on the screen there, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a Pontiac Bonneville, the white car that's on the far side of that driveway. I was sitting in that car when the tornado came through and tore the house in half. And it sort of bounced off the ground. I remember the car rising, and I opened the door, and the back windshield shattered when it happened. There was a huge pressure change, and it happened so quickly, and your ears pop. It was a very strange experience to be in a tornado, and my friend Mike took these pictures right afterwards. I also say there was an emotional tornado in my time, and this is the thing that really got me out of Kansas and off into other strange lands. My parents, after 26 years of marriage, they split up. They sold the house, and my whole Kansas experience to that point, I decided I was going to move to New York, so I was out of Lawrence, off to the big city. About 2 years later, I ended up moving to Los Angeles, and I was out in LA for 23 years. And it's a big, I say it's, the big Technicolor world out there. This is where they make movies. And along the way, in 23 years, you definitely meet people with no brains and no heart and no courage. And once in a while, you meet a wonderful, good person that will help you out. And you certainly, in LA, with being Hollywood, you meet phony people pretending that they're others, they're not who they say they are. And you'll meet an occasional bad person, too, there's no question. That just happens along the way. But the last 10 years of my time in Los Angeles, I became an interactive media producer. I started learning graphic design, something I was interested in, and I got involved in DVD and Blu-ray work very early on. So there's a picture of me. I guess I'm working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer at that point, but I also worked on the original Star Wars movies. I worked on the first 3 Harry Potter movies, Fight Club, Too Fast, Too Furious, Gilligan's Island, Citizen Kane. These are like the menus when you put your DVD or Blu-ray disc in and you get animated screens and then you like play movie scene selections and the advance and all that. And there's also trivia games and quizzes. And it sort of, those especially, when you're taking either you as a viewer or another character from the story into like these situations where you're advancing them through plots and, things they have to, challenges they have to overcome, that sort of thing. And to move to the next level. So I was sort of had that mindset, as I'm doing this, and I certainly wasn't thinking of being an author. But one of the things that happened was my friend Barbara, who was also from Lawrence, she was working at Paramount Pictures at the time, and she called me one day and said, I live across the swimming pool in this apartment complex from this guy who owns a pair of the ruby slippers, the ones that were actually in the movie, and his name is Michael Shaw. And I'm going to show you this here because it's kind of fun. These shoes have been in the news a lot lately. They've been in nationally global news, worldwide news, because they were recently recovered by the FBI. A year after I saw these, this is 2004, they were stolen. And these are the shoes that they've been looking for. There was a 14-year search, and finally the FBI just found them a couple of months ago, and that was kind of made world news. And they verified that they found the actual pair. And Michael Jackson at one point offered him $2 million for them, and he turned them down. So I was having this wild reaction. I'm sitting in this guy's living room looking at a pair of Judy Garland shoes. There they are, and that's my friend Barbara. And I have this sort of dual reaction. They're very cool. I'm thinking people stand in line and they want to see these, and Michael Jackson wants to buy them for $2 million. But at the same time, they were designed by a costume designer named Adrian. They're just a nice pair of women's 1930s pumps. They've got sequins sewn on them and bows on them, but they're not real. They don't really work. And the magic what if light bulb went off in my child head, and I was like, what if these are the real shoes from Oz? What if the whole story really happened and people don't understand that they've got the actual shoes from Oz and that Oz is a real place? And I started thinking this would make a really cool story if somebody was looking at these shoes up close and it turned out that they were the actual shoes from Oz. So I started thinking more and more about it. And one of the things that bothered me in the book, by the way, there's a couple big differences in between the book and the movie. In the movie, she gets hit on the head and dreams the whole thing, and she goes to Oz in sort of a fantasy dream. In the book, she actually goes there. She's not hit on the head or knocked out. The house is lifted off the ground. She goes to Oz, and at the end, she clicks her heels together, and it says she flies across this earth and sky, and the shoes were lost forever in the desert. That's what it says in the book. And I hated that because I'm like, what happened to these shoes? Where did they go? I always wondered what happened to the magic shoes. Well, they were silver shoes. They weren't ruby slippers. That's another big change. The reason being is that if you think about a movie going from black and white to color, if they're silver, they don't look any different. They look exactly the same. So they decided to make them red to bring out really Technicolor and make them look, very impressive once they switched the movie to color. So that's the reason why they were ruby slippers. But in the original story, they are silver shoes. And I kept thinking, well, if these are the real shoes from Oz, it would be the original ones that L. Frank Baum wrote about in 1900. So I'm thinking about L. Frank Baum and his life, again, using what if. And I'm looking at his life and it's finding out that, before he was an author, he'd had other jobs, all kinds of jobs. He'd run a newspaper for a while. He'd been an actor, and one of the things he did was he traveled all around the Midwest selling china, and he did that for like hotel chains and general stores and things like that. And he'd pack up a big suitcase and travel all around. And again, I'm thinking, what if that was a cover for something else? What if he was really doing something else while he was traveling around the Midwest? And I'm a big fan of like X-Files and that sort of thing, and I'm thinking, what if he was sent to explore what am I trying to say? Unexplored phenomena, unexplained phenomena, that's the word I'm looking for. So like the X-Files where he's sent, there's no FBI yet. The FBI didn't start until after the turn of the century. Teddy Roosevelt was part of it. This is the late 1800s, but it's still an undercover agency with the government. So I'm thinking that L. Frank Baum was sent to investigate and report back on this girl named Dorothy who had disappeared for days and suddenly comes back after a big search. She mysteriously reappears, and she's talking about this place that she'd been to where there's talking animals and there's an Emerald City and there's witches of the East and the West and silver shoes, and they realize that she's been to Oz, and so they send Mr. Baum to interview her, and the notes that he has from that interview become his book, The Wizard of Oz, and he decides to release it to the public to leak that information to them. So that's my background. I'm thinking, along the way, if this is going to happen now in this world today and we're finding one of these shoes, that means the FBI would definitely be involved looking for them. And there would also be, I'm thinking about the wizard, what happened to him? Well, he came back in a hot air balloon. at the same time, that Dorothy came back. And maybe there was an underground group, a cult, an organization called the Order of the Wizard, and they wore the round green glasses that he had them wear in the Emerald City, and they were waiting to go back to the Land of Oz, and they were hoping to find the shoes as well. So I'm thinking, who's all this going to happen to now? And of course it's going to be me when I was a kid. I wanted this to be my time where I discovered that Oz was a real place. So I invented a character, Donald Gardner, and there's a direct parallel in the name, D-O-G-A, Donald Gardner, Dorothy Gale. I did that on purpose. The first two letters of both of their names match. So I also realized as I was writing that there are parallels to the other main characters. Donald's mother, he's the one that Donald relates to the most. She's sort of the heart of the family. He can talk to her, she listens, she's very compassionate. His father, they're a little aloof. He's certainly not a bad man, but he's the first one to fly off the handle, cracks sort of wise jokes. I think of him more as like the Cowardly Lion type character. And then there's a fourth character that's not a member of the family. His name is George Clark. And he's an older guy, but 50 years earlier, he's the one who found the other silver shoe on his farm in Missouri. So what happens is, without giving too much plot away of the silver shoes, as I'm thinking of it, I'm thinking that the mother's taking the shoe and she doesn't know what she has, and she has it appraised on Antiques Roadshow, and it's televised. So the minute it's televised, people that know what it is, and she doesn't know, the appraisers are trying to evaluate it, but they don't know what it is either, they see it. So you've now got the FBI agents and the Order of the Wizard and all these people coming. But George Clark sees it too, and he's the brains of the outfit. He's the one that has the plan for what to do with the shoes. He wants to get them together, and I'm not going to say anymore because I'll spoil too much. But I also had a couple of must-haves. You kind of like, as you're going to write a story, you think, I got to have this in my story. I wanted a castle, a mysterious castle sort of deep in the woods. I wanted to have a big sort of climax scene there. And also, I've been fascinated with flying monkeys ever since a kid. They terrified me when I was 5, but the older I got, the more I just thought they were cool and fascinating. So they're definitely flying monkeys in my first story. I wanted to have a big swarm around the castle, so that's part of the big climax. Silver shoes, ultimately, once I finally decided to put it on paper, it took me about 6 months to write the first draft. I just sort of, it poured out of me when I said, I just got to write this down. Not long after Silver Shoes was published, I ended up moving to Kansas again from Los Angeles after 23 years, so I always say the Silver Shoes brought me back to Kansas, just like they did Dorothy. I got a letter about 2 weeks after I got here from the State Librarian of Kansas telling me that this book had won a Kansas Notable Book Award. And what that was, I didn't even know what it was. It's a library award, and it meant that 200 libraries across the state of Kansas, both public and school libraries, bought my book. And I got to go around and talk to kids, and I got to talk to people all over the state of Kansas. And one of the things, some of them had read the book already, which I thought was really cool. They would ask me, what happens next? Because at the end of the book, I basically, no spoilers again, I'm opening the whole world of Oz to Donald Gardner, a kid who doesn't know much about it at all. He's never read the books. He saw the movie, he thinks the shoes should be red, he doesn't understand why they're silver, or believe that he really has one of the two witches' shoes. But, so that's the beginning, and people say, well, what happens next? Well, L. Frank Baum's second book that he wrote, his sequel was called The Marvelous Land of Oz. And I was thinking, I don't know that I want to write a sequel, but maybe there's something from that book, that I could take. This is my opinion of sequels. I mean, I think of I don't really want to see Titanic 2, or Gone with the Wind 3, or The Sound of Music 11. This is not my favorite thing to do, and there's usually, when sequels are made, some of those other 3 over there are actual movies and not so good. And I thought, I've got to have a reason to write this story. So toward the end of Silver Shoes, in that forest I was telling you with the castles and the flying monkeys, there is a dark wizard that appears in front for Donald. And he's the one that calls the flying monkeys, and he wants the shoes, and we don't know much about him. We don't find out too much about him, except for that at one point he owned the the silver shoes, and he wants them back. And that's about as much as we know about him in the first book. So I thought more about him, and I was looking at L. Frank Baum's book, The Land of Oz, The Marvelous Land of Oz, and there is a wizard mentioned very early on in the first 2 chapters, I think, where there's a witch named Mombi. And the old witch Mombi goes up into the mountains to trade magic potions with this wizard, and she comes back with the powder of life. And that's when I started to think, wait a minute, there might be something here for a sequel in my stories. And the wizard is sometimes called Dr. Nicodic, he's sometimes called Dr. Pipt. And I thought that was kind of weird. It's like his name's shifting. Maybe he's using aliases or something like that. But what he does and what she trades for is the powder of life. The powder of life is the magic substance that you can sprinkle on inanimate objects, and you say a few magic words, and you can bring them to life. And I thought that would be really cool if it ended up in our world. I mean, what if you had a footstool, or you had an antique doll, or you had a dining table, and you could sprinkle it on these and they would come to life and have a life of their own? What would that mean? And these three objects specifically, without spoiler alerts, are in my second book, The Powder of Life. I also was looking at characters like Glinda, wondering what she would be like as a real person. If she'd ever been to our world, what would that be like? So I started to write about her as if she were a person. She's a witch from Oz, but she's also real. In that story as well, Silver Shoes, toward the end, when I've got the FBI agents involved, I allude to the idea that there are other worlds out there. I say there are rabbit holes, there are looking glasses, there are other realms where people don't grow old or age. And I'm thinking, this is like Wonderland or Neverland. Those places exist as well. So the White Rabbit shows up early on in The Powder of Life, and he agrees to he gives Donald a message that his life is in danger, and in exchange for that, he wants Donald to help him find his stolen pocket watch. And Donald doesn't know what's going on. He didn't agree to do this, but he's now agreed to help the White Rabbit find his pocket watch. And I was reading Alice in Wonderland, and there's sections in there as well where it talks about the watch at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, where you have, they talk about how you can beat time, you can be nice to time. As long as you're nice to time, you can manipulate it. And I'm thinking the watch that they're talking about is a time travel device. So I used that as well in this story, and I made the watch, once Donald recovers it, he can actually manipulate time. So I knew I had ingredients now with those various things, the wizard, the White Rabbit, Glinda. Well, they formed my second book, The Powder of Life. And that was published in 2014. Then, again, I'm looking at my first two books. I thought I was done, but apparently I'm happy to say readers didn't, and for the last few years they were saying, why are you going to do anything more? I was looking at L. Frank Baum's third book, Ozma of Oz, and thinking, is there something in there? One of the things I allude to, because I talked about the wizard in my book, is he Dr. Pip, is he Dr. Nicodic? I describe him as being the brother of another evil, sinister villain in the Oz series by L. Frank Baum, the Gnome King. And basically this wizard that lives up in the mountains is the brother of the one that lives under the ground. And they're both trying to conquer the world together. So the Gnome King is a big character in Ozma of Oz. He has a belt. He gets most of his power from a magic belt. And I thought, well, here I'm using the ingredients, the silver shoes from the first book, the powder of life from the second book, the magic belt from the third book. And I started to imagine what it would be like if the Gnome King came to our world looking for the belt. So you have him now, a real person in our world. I also have Mombi looking for the powder of life because it was stolen in the last book. She wants to recover it. So they are real characters that exist now in my third story. So I don't want to give too much of a spoiler alert away for Magic Belt, but that's pretty much brings us up to the end. This book is brand new, it just came out. I will leave you one last thing though, book trailer, because I was told I needed to have one when I released Silver Shoes. I didn't know what a book trailer was. And I thought, you guys know what a movie trailer is, right? Mm-hmm. So you see scenes from movies. It's supposed to basically sell the movie before you see it, give you little clips, little ideas of what it's going to be like, and hopefully you want to do that. And a friend of mine is a book publicist. She said, you need to have a book trailer. So I thought, well, how do you even do that? Because, you don't have scenes from a book that you can cut together. She said, you do it with images. And, I was an animator. I could animate my titles or whatever. And I put it together with stock music, and I put it on YouTube. And I'm happy to say, as of now, it's got like 14,500 hits or something. It's pretty incredible. So it definitely helped me sell my book. It was a good idea. So I'm going to play you my book trailer for Silver Shoes. There's one big difference, though, in the one that you're seeing now. A friend of mine in LA who writes film scores saw it. He just said, I had to send you this. He sent me an original score that he wrote for the trailer. So this is not the music that is online. This is stuff that he sent me, and I was thrilled that he did it. It has a sort of Harry Potter-ish sound to it, but that kind of works for what I'm writing, so I was really happy with it. So this is my book trailer for Silver Shoes with original music. So that's a book trailer. This is my book trailer. The credits you see are for the online stock music. I did write a permission to use them, and I'm using royalty-free stuff, but it was certainly helped and worked. I do have all my books for you online folks watching. They're available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, in both ebook, Kindle, Nook, and trade paperback as well. For the non-virtual and the virtual, I have both. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I can wrap it up. If you want to know about writing, book trailers, DVDs, you're good? Okay, thank you so much. Take care.